Continuing our study of lenses, I'll now look at the property we call focal length. Now, lenses come in a vast range of sizes, and this is the Nikon range of lenses, and they normally fall into two groups: zooms, those are variable focal length lenses, or fixed focal length lenses, which we tend to call prime lenses. The main defining attributes are maximum aperture and focal length. So if you're describing a lens, it'll be like a 500mm f4 lens. So it's a 500mm focal length lens with a maximum aperture of f4. Similarly, a 28mm lens, f2.8. Now the maximum aperture tends to define the width of the lens, the front element, and the focal length tends to define the length of the lens in general terms. So focal length is the distance from the sensor, measured in millimeters, a lens must be in order to correctly focus a distant scene which is at infinity. So here we have the lens and here we have our sensor. Now, because the light is coming from infinity, this one little point of light is traveling virtually, well, these rays of light are traveling virtually in parallel lines for the purposes of illustration. And they're all coming to a sharp focus on the film sensor, on the camera sensor. Okay, for the sake of illustration, the rays of light are from each individual part of the scene. Now, we've seen this before on the previous videos, are almost traveling parallel lines up to the lens. So this is why it looks like they're traveling parallel lines. In fact, they're actually coming from a single point way out at infinity, basically. So this illustration shows a 50mm lens, and we know that a 50mm lens is 50mm from the sensor when it focuses something at infinity on the sensor. So 50mm from the center of the lens to the sensor. And again, for these illustrations, we'll use a simple lens, one element lens, because that makes more sense to illustrate with. Now, a 28mm lens, the lens is effectively 28mm from the sensor. 50mm lens, 50mm. Okay, so you get the idea. 100mm, and generally with a simple lens, you'll find that the amount of barrel shaping determines the focal length of the lens. If it's more of a flat affair, you'll have a very long focal length lens. If you have a very bulbous kind of lens, it will focus very closely to itself. Okay, but these are for simple lenses, just for illustration purposes. So for focal length and angle of view. So this is why we need different focal length lenses, because as the focal length reduces, like in this 28mm lens, which is 28mm from the sensor, in real life, of course, we can't actually do this because we'd actually find the lens is inside the camera body. So they have to do, the lens manufacturers have to simulate this kind of property with wide angle lenses. But illustration purposes, it's 28mm from the sensor, and it will actually capture an angle of view of about 75 degrees. Okay, so it's looking at things over there, things in front, and things over here. A 50mm lens, 50mm from the sensor, will capture an angle of view of 43 degrees, which is narrower. Okay, so up there, everything in between, down to there. 100mm captures half of 43-ish, which is 22 degrees approximately. Okay, so that captures a much narrower angle of view. But of course, the images that it provides, each one of these lenses provides, fills the entire sensor. And the only way it can do that is to, with a wide angle lens, is to demagnify the image so it fills the sensor. The 50mm gives you a kind of 1:1 size, and a 100mm magnifies in order to still fill that sensor, because it's capturing a much smaller angle of view. It must magnify the image in order to fill the sensor. Lenses projection circle. Now, when you have a lens, they project a circular image onto the back of the camera, and in the center of that, of course, hopefully the sensor is positioned. And for a full frame sensor, full frame lenses are designed to just go right around the outside of the sensor, giving you full detail and full illumination around the outside. Okay. So for full frame cameras, you need to make sure that you're using full frame lenses. In fact, usually using camera manufacturers' lenses, you won't be able to use a crop sensor lens on a full frame camera. They're physically incompatible usually. If we then cover the full frame sensor, the full frame lens area, and then put a crop sensor in the middle, you can see it only covers a smaller portion of the entire image that the lens is producing. So only the central part of the projected image is captured by the sensor if we're using a cropped sensor there. So if we zoom into that cropped area, what we're doing is effectively magnifying that area to produce a full image that the camera is capturing. And so instead of having the original image, we have a magnified view filling the entire sensor. So here we have the full frame image, and here we have the cropped image, and we can see it's a magnified part of the center of this. So we can use full frame lenses on cropped sensor cameras. Okay, so there's the full frame image from the full frame lens, and that's the portion that we're seeing with a crop sensor, which is that area there. Conversely, if we use a lens specifically designed for a crop sensor, it will just cover the area of a crop sensor and no more. So here we have the circular image produced by the lens, here we have the crop sensor, and it just encompasses the entire sensor. Okay. So this allows lenses to be made smaller and cheaper generally. Now then, if we then decide to use that lens with a full frame sensor, which is this area here, all we'll get is a circular image, because there's no image created by the lens to fill all the rest of the sensor area. Okay, so crop sensor lenses cannot be used effectively on full frame cameras. So when you're starting off with your camera system, you maybe need to bear in mind the type of cameras you're going to use in the future as to what lenses you actually buy. So changing the length of the focus of the lens on the camera, and it's always defined in millimeters, changes the angle of view. So a 15mm lens, basically a fisheye lens, can produce an angle of view of 180 degrees, and we can go all the way up to maybe 1000mm, which will give us a 2.5 degrees angle of view. And of course, each time we change the focal length, it effectively changes the magnification of the image that we're capturing on the sensor. We can also alter the perspective, the relationship of near and far objects, by using different lens focal lengths. Different lens focal lengths alter the amount of depth of field for any given aperture. So wide-angle lenses tend to give you a lot greater depth of field than telephotos at the same focal length. So it changes the amount of camera movement that will be perceived as blur. So wide-angle lenses tend to emphasize blurring less than a telephoto lens does. So with a 50mm lens, we've already seen that it gives us an angle of view of about 43 degrees. A one-to-one size, or one magnification. It looks normal to the human eye. A 28mm lens gives us an angle of view of 75 degrees. And the 15mm, a fisheye lens, can give us an angle of view of 180 degrees. So that's everything right around there. 100mm is half the angle of view of a 50mm. Okay, 135, 250. And of course there's a whole range of different focal lengths in between these illustrated. All the way up to maybe 1000mm. Some manufacturers produce those. So this is just an illustration of a typical scene obtained with different focal length lenses, and they've all been on a tripod taken from exactly the same spot, all with different focal length lenses, all with the same exposure. And this is an important principle. So the exposure was ISO, which is the sensor speed 100, shutter speed of 125th of a second, and an aperture of f16. So it's important to remember that the exposure for any lens should be the same for any given scene, whether it's a wide angle lens, a telephoto lens. It should all be the same ISO, shutter speed and aperture, irrespective of the lens you're using. So we'll start off with an 8mm, 180 degrees of view, and it's a circular image in this case. This is still a fisheye lens, but it's a full frame fisheye lens. So between the corner there and the corner here, or the corner there, it's 180 degrees. Notice the exposure is exactly the same. 12mm. Now this gives you what's called a rectilinear type of image. So there's no distortion in very little distortion in the image. And it gives you an angle of view of about 122 degrees from corner to corner. 24mm, 84 degrees. Okay, so increasing the focal length, and you can see that we're actually magnifying into this ridge of rock here each time we magnifying in. But it's all from exactly the same spot, and each image is filling the sensor. Hence, increasing the focal length magnifies the image, decreasing the focal length demagnifies the image. Okay. So I've gone up to 300mm in this instance, and again, looking at the exposure, it's all still the same. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea as to what focal lengths mean on your digital cameras.